Okay, perfect. Well, I appreciate you all having me here. And I think what I'm going to do, Bert's told me that there's often a lot of conversation, and I know from having been in Bert's courses that there's often a lot of conversation. So what I'm going to do is just try to start off by setting up what I think is the dialectic in this chapter, and try to give you a sense of what the phenomenon is that Merleau-Ponty is interested in this chapter, what he thinks the two kinds of wrong views are that you can have about how to account for the phenomenon, the empiricist and the intellectualist view, and then try to start to say something today, and hopefully say a little bit more next time, about what the right thing is to say about the phenomenology. Bert said that this is probably one of the most important chapters in the book, and I think that's right. I think this is really the chapter where you get what I think of as the essential phenomenon in perceptual experience, the experience of objects. That's one of the most basic things that you can talk about when you're talking about perceptual experience. And Merleau-Ponty thinks that's a key to the experience of objects is a phenomenon that he calls right at the beginning of the chapter the phenomenon of perceptual constancy. Right at the opening paragraph of the chapter. I have unfortunately an old copy of the book, but Bert tells me you have a concordance. Yeah.
You say anything.
Okay. So this is easy. We don't even need the concordance for this. But the very first sentence of the chapter, whatever page that is for you guys, 290. Sorry, 299 in the old copy.
And for us, 348.
348. Okay. So just the opening paragraph says a thing has characteristics or properties, quote unquote, for both of these, which are stable even if they don't entirely serve to define it. And we propose to approach the phenomenon of reality, the phenomenon of what there is, the phenomenon of what exists for us to have experiences of, by studying perceptual constants. A thing has, in the first place, its size and its shape throughout variations of perspective which are merely apparent. We don't attribute these appearances to the object itself, but regard them as accidental features of our relations with it and not as being of it. What we do mean by this, and on what basis? What do we mean by this, and on what basis do we judge that form or size are the form and the size of the object? So what he's talking about here is the idea. It's a well-known idea, known to psychologists from the middle of the 19th century, that when I see an object, I see it to have a constant size and a constant shape and a constant color throughout variations in the context in which it's presented to me. So it looks to be the same size throughout variations in my distance to it. As I walk closer to you and further away from you, it doesn't look like you grow. You look to remain the same size. And as I take an object and I rotate it with respect to me, as I take this book and I rotate it with respect to me, it doesn't look like the shape of the object changes. It looks like the shape of the object remains the same. And with respect to color, as the lighting context changes, as the lights get dimmer or brighter, as I take an object inside or outside, it doesn't look like the color of the object changes, despite the fact that the context in which it's presented to me does change. And the way Merleau-Ponty characterizes this is he says, the object has, in the first place, its size and its shape and its color throughout variations in presentational context. Now, you might think this is a sort of strange fact about our experience of objects. You might think it's a strange fact because it turns out that as the context in which an object is presented to me changes, the image that's projected from the object onto my retina changes dramatically. So think about the very simple case of the size of an object. As I walk closer to the door, the size of the image that the door projects onto my retina grows, and it grows correlative to the distance between me and the door. So if perceptual experience is related in any sort of obvious way to the image that's cast onto the retina, you'd have expected that as I walk closer to the door, it looks like the door gets bigger. It would look like the door gets bigger. And psychologists in the 19th century were confused about why that didn't happen. I mean, if the image grows as I get closer, how come it doesn't look like the object grows? If the image cast onto the retina from the object grows, why doesn't it look like the object grows? And you remember all the way back in the sort of introduction to the phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty said the idea that the features of the experience are correlated with the features of the retinal image is what he called the constancy hypothesis. And that's a hypothesis that psychologists have often found natural, and certainly in the 19th century they found natural. And if you find that hypothesis natural, then there's going to be a problem about why it is that when the features of the image change, it's not the case that the features of the experienced object change. So that's a problem. That's a sort of natural problem for psychologists to think about. And of course, the standard structure for a chapter in Merleau-Ponty, insofar as we can talk about these things as having structure, because they do wander quite a lot. But the standard structure for a chapter in Merleau-Ponty, and it's true about this chapter also, is that Merleau-Ponty is going to go through and say, well, here's how a certain kind of empiricist tried to account for this phenomenon, and what's wrong with it, why it misses some aspect of the phenomenology of our experience of size constancy, say. Here's how a standard intellectualist like Kant or Helmholtz or someone like that tries to account for the phenomenon, what's wrong with it, what's wrong with that account, what it misses. And then here's what the right kind of phenomenological account ought to say. So I'm going to try to take you through some of those things. Well, okay, so right at the beginning of the chapter, Merleau-Ponty talks about the empiricist account of perceptual constancy. So I want to say something briefly about two different kinds of empiricist account. One that Merleau-Ponty doesn't mention, but might be relevant for people who've done a little bit of analytic philosophy of mind or sort of history of analytic philosophy. And then a kind of empiricist account that Merleau-Ponty does talk about. That's due to a 19th century German psychologist named Hubert. But the first account that I want to say something about is an empiricist account that you find, a kind of sense datum theory, that you find defended by lots of sense datum theorists, but maybe most famously by Bertrand Russell in the Problems of Philosophy, this book of his from, say, 15 or something like that. So on this kind of empiricist account, an empiricist like Russell, a sense datum theorist like Russell says, what it is to have perceptual experiences of the world is to be presented with sense data. And sense data have this feature, namely, everything that every feature that you think a sense datum has, it does have. And you couldn't be wrong about what those features are. And in particular, Russell thinks that the features of the sense data are correlated in some pretty close fashion with something like features of the retinal image. So Russell takes a case in the Problems of Philosophy. I don't have it with me, otherwise I would read it right near the beginning, in chapter 2. Russell takes a case of what we would think of as color constancy. He says, look at that table over there that's sort of slightly unevenly lit. Well, a natural thing to say about that table, says Russell, is that it looks like it's got a constant color. It's a single color, brown, or this wall is a single color, white. This wall maybe is brown. it looks like it is a single color. But Russell says if you're a sense datum theorist, you realize that that's not actually right, because if you look closely enough, you'll find that it doesn't appear to be a single color. It looks different with respect to color in different lighting contexts. It looks a little bit more yellow over there and a little bit more gray over there, for instance. And Russell says that's what we know is true because, after all, that's true as a matter of the features of the retinal image. I mean, the wavelength of the light that's reflected off the wall there is different from the wavelength of the light that's reflected off the wall there. And there are different sense data that go along with it. So Russell says, although you might have thought it was natural to say that I experienced the color of the wall to be the same throughout variations in lighting contact, as a matter of fact, that's false. I don't have that experience. But the right thing to say about this case, according to Russell, is that I believe that the wall is a constant color throughout variations in lighting context. So it's not that I have an experience of the color of the wall as constant. I just have a belief. Okay? So here's a case where we have a funny situation. There's Russell's strategy is just to deny the phenomenology. His strategy is just to say, that's not really, you thought that was the way it seemed to you, but you weren't really right. If you look carefully enough, what you discover is that, no, it actually looks a different color there than it does there. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that although Russell is driven to deny the phenomenology as a result of this sort of pre-theoretical commitments about what the experience has to be because of his pre-theoretical commitment to the sense data theory of perception, it turns out that it's pretty easy to argue against Russell's view. So let me say again what the view is and see if anyone has an idea how you might argue against it. The view again is that it's not that I don't experience the color of the wall to be constant throughout variations in lighting. I just believe it, and it's that belief that I mistake for the experience of color constancy. Can anyone think of a way you might argue? Yeah, give it a shot. Okay, so that's an interesting question, right? That's the question, and an empiricist might be interested in that kind of response, because empiricists do generally think that the thoughts that I have about the way things are come out of the more basic experiences. And that'll point to the fact that there's a kind of inconsistency in Russell. He thinks as an empiricist, he might think we get our thoughts from our experiences, but here's a belief that doesn't seem to be connected to our underlying experiences. But that doesn't seem, maybe he could tell some story. Maybe I just happen to have prior beliefs that objects have constant properties, and so it's that gives me this sort of in general belief about color constancy. So he might be able to patch it up a little bit. It would divorce it from a kind of Humean empiricism. But try another one, yeah. Good, okay, so that's true. He tells us, so that's a kind of phenomenological argument. That's the kind of argument that a Husserl or a Merleau-Ponty might give. They would say, well, geez, what's happening here is you're reading your pre-theoretical commitments into the description of the experience and telling us what it must be like rather than paying attention to it. So that's right. Now, but the problem is that Russell could just say, no, I'm not, right? Couldn't he just sort of say, I am not. That's really the way it looks to me. Doggone it. Right? Or he could say that. And the difficulty is that if he says that, it's a little hard to know how we're supposed to proceed. Any other ideas? Yeah, one more.
I wonder what should trigger this constancy belief in one case and where the colors are really would not trigger that.
Okay, that's an interesting thought. That might be like the first idea. So, in other words, if it's really true that our thoughts about the way things are grounded in our experiences, how come we have different thoughts when, in some cases, and they don't correlate properly with the experience? But he might be able to patch it up in a sort of way. He might say, well, we have background sort of knowledge about the way the world is, and that's what's giving us these beliefs. But there's this, how about this? I mean, there's this sort of interesting fact. It turns out that it doesn't really matter what my beliefs are about the way the world is. My experiences are just much more robust than my beliefs. So, for instance, I could have the experience that I have of this wall as being a constant color, no matter what beliefs I have about it. I mean, suppose I know that I'm in a very funny sort of laboratory experiment, where, as a matter of fact, that wall really is radically different shades of color. It's red over there, and green over there, and yellow over there. But for whatever, I'm sort of tricked, and it's an illusion, and it looks to me the way it does. Namely, it looks to me to have a constant color. It seems that no matter how much I believe that the colors are different as the lighting context changes, I continue to have the experience of the thing as constantly colored. And if Russell thinks that the way you account for the experience is by saying, well, it's just a belief that I have, then it ought to be the case that whenever I change beliefs, I'll change experiences. But that doesn't seem to happen. So it looks like the experience is more robust than and can run independent of the beliefs that we have about the way things are. So that seems like a reason not to think that that kind of empiricist account is a very good one. But it's not a phenomenological reason, and maybe that's why Merleau-Ponty doesn't consider the Russellian account. But Merleau-Ponty does consider another kind of empiricist account. He considers this account by Ewald Hering. He's talking about it in the second paragraph of the paper, of this chapter, sorry. Let's see. So right in the second paragraph, right after where we left off leaving on 299 in the old book, which is
so it's still 348.
Still 348. He says, what's presented to us in the case of each object, the psychologist will assert, psychologist here means the empiricist, are sizes and shapes which always vary with the perspective, and it's conventional to regard as true the size which the object has when within reach, or the shape which it assumes when it's in a plane parallel to the frontal elevation, so the shape that it has when it's presented face on. These are, okay, so let's say that. Now here's an account that you could give of that sort. I think he gives it. Here's an account. I won't read it. I'll just give it to you. Here's an account that you could give of this sort that Hering does give. And the account goes like this. It says, well, it's true that when the context changes, when I get closer, say, to the door, something changes, namely, a different retinal image is projected. But I still have an experience of the door as the same height, as the same size. Now, an empiricist like Hering, who wants to try to account for that phenomenon, will say, well, okay, what's going on there is that the true size, as he says in this sentence that I just read, the true size is the size of the object when I'm standing normal distance to it. Maybe that, and what the normal distance is the conventional one. It's the one that when the object is within reach, or when I can do the normal thing with the object, and so on. And the true size is the size of the object as I experience it to be when I'm that distance from it. So what happens when I'm some other distance from it? Well, the Hering kind of empiricist will say, when I'm further away, what I do is I replace the experience of the size of the door that I'm having from this distance too far away with my memory of what the size was when I was the appropriate distance, when I was the true distance from it. Okay? So that says, well, the reason I have this experience of constancy is that when I'm an inappropriate distance from the object, I just replace the experience I'm now having with the experience I normally have, the experience of it at the appropriate distance. Okay, well, Merleau-Ponty thinks that's an account that really gets an important fact about the phenomenology wrong. Can anyone say anything about what that fact might be? What that fact about the phenomenology is? Suppose it's really true. Here I am. I'm right up here. I'm looking at the size of the door. And the reason the door looks to be the very same size as it did when I was back here is that, well, when I'm up here, I'm actually having the very same experience that I had when I was back here. I'm replacing the experience that I have of it up close with my memory of the experience that I had of it when I was back here. How does that sound? Does that get the phenomenology right?
There's the part about the temporality of it that isn't really iterative, but it's sort of more continuously flowing, that it's hard to imagine that you would constantly be repeating the experience that you originally had.
Okay. So, I think temporality may come in as further down the line, but I don't think we even need to get that complicated. Just imagine you could instantaneously go from here to there. Right? Is it a very good account of the way the size of the door looks when I'm close up like this, that it looks exactly the same as it looks with respect to size when I'm back here?
It doesn't take into account any contextual features?
Okay, good, right. It doesn't take into account any contextual features at all. In particular, it doesn't take into account the distance to the object. And what you'd like to say is that, no, it's just not true. It's true that the door looks to be the same size. It looks like it hasn't changed with respect to size. But still, the size that it looks, although it looks to be the same size, I don't experience it the same way, right? Now, we don't know how to characterize that difference, but it does seem right to say, it's just not true that my experience of the size of the door is exactly the same when I'm here and when I'm here. Right? So we need to make a distinction, says Merleau-Ponty, between the size the object looks to be. That's one thing. And that is what remains constant throughout variations. Again, we have size, shape, color, different contextual variations. The size or shape or color that the object looks to be, that remains constant throughout contextual variation. That's one thing. But there's something else, too, that's really a part of the experience. And that's what Merleau-Ponty calls the way the size looks. Okay? So the way the size of an object looks really does change as I get closer to it or further away from it, despite the fact that the size it looks to be doesn't change. Let's see, I was going to find the best passage where he makes this distinction. Okay. So now about 7 sentences into the second paragraph. I'm still on 299. You guys might have turned the page. I'm not
No,
sure.
We're still on 348, actually.
Okay. What he says is, now in 299, 5 lines from the bottom. He gives the, But this psychological reconstitution of objective size or shape takes for granted what has to be.
By the way, it's the top of 349.
Okay, we have
4 lines down.
This psychological reconstitution, the Herring kind of characterization of objective size or shape, takes for granted what has to be explained, namely a gamut of determinate sizes and shapes from which it is sufficient to select one as the real size or shape. This is slightly complicated to explain, but I think I can do it. So what he's imagining is that you have a determinate set of objective sizes of the door, one from here, as seen from here, one as seen from here, one as seen from here, one, and so on. And all you have to do in giving your psychological account of the phenomenon of size constancy is pick which one of those is the true size. Which one is it? Well, it's the one that you're presented with when you're at the appropriate distance, whatever that is, the conventional distance. That's the true size, according to Herring, the empiricist. And you just select one of those, right? And that's, when you've got that, that's the one that characterizes the experience that you have of the size of the object, no matter what the context is. Okay. And he says that presupposes the idea that you've already got these determinate experiences of the size of the object. Now, Merleau-Ponty in this chapter and in many other places, I'm sure you've seen this already, thinks that it's characteristic of almost all of our perceptual experience that it's got an indeterminate nature, that there's something essentially indeterminate about everyday lived perceptual experience, and that one of the things that's missing in the empiricist account of Herring is that it misses the indeterminacy. And the indeterminacy, in this case, is the fact that, the tension between the fact that, although the size looks to be constant, in some sense or another, the way that size is experienced by me changes as the variation changes. We need to do more to spell out what that way is, what it is for the way of a size to look, to change throughout contextual variation. But the essential indeterminacy in the experience of constant sizes comes from the tension between these two things, the fact that the size that it looks to be remains constant, and the way the size looks changes. So this changes throughout contextual variation. That's a typical kind of phenomenological argument that Merleau-Ponty will give against an empiricist kind of view. Yeah, great.
I'm curious to know how the determinate, indeterminate comes into play here, because it seems like somebody like Gibson, who, as far as I recall, doesn't really have anything about this indeterminate, determinate distinction, which really is important for Merleau-Ponty, could accept this distinction without accounting for it in a way which demands an explanation in terms of the determinate and indeterminate.
I think, properly understood, we'll see that Gibson does really have an essential place for what I think of as indeterminacy in the Merleau-Pontian sense. Indeterminacy, in sort of shorthand, affordances are indeterminate. Gibsonian kinds of affordances are indeterminate in the Merleau-Ponty sense. And that'll become clearer once I spell out what indeterminacy is. Okay, so that's a classic kind of phenomenological argument. Here's the empiricist account of this phenomenon: size constancy, shape constancy, color constancy. Here's the empiricist account, and look, lo and behold, if you pay proper attention to the phenomenology, you'll notice that there's an essential feature of the experience, of the phenomenology of the experience, that's lacking in this Herring kind of empiricist account. It can't make the distinction between the size the object looks to be and the way that size looks in the current presentation. Okay? And that really is an essential distinction that's part of the phenomenology that you need to account for. So if it's true, and I think this is true, if it's true that what the psychologist ought to be explaining is how is the phenomenology as we really experience it, then the empiricist account fails completely because it fails to make an essential distinction as part of the phenomenology. So here's a way you could think of it. You could think the phenomenology is the data. If you're interested in the relation between phenomenology and psychological explanation or phenomenology and neuroscientific explanation, here's a proposal. The phenomenology is the data that the psychologist and that the neuroscientist need to try to account for. And often Merleau-Ponty's criticisms of psychological or neuroscientific accounts take the form that we've just seen. Their criticisms that say, well, you give an explanation that depends on a misreading of the phenomenology. And in particular, it's an explanation that can't account for a crucial phenomenological distinction. Okay, so those are two kinds of empiricist accounts. One that Merleau-Ponty doesn't talk about, the Russell kind, that just denies there's any phenomenology at all. So since it denies there's any phenomenology at all, we know we're in a weird area, and we can't really use phenomenological arguments to argue against Russell. So we got to find something else. But now here's Herring. He's got the phenomenon. He's got an account of the phenomenology, and he's tried to give a psychological explanation for why it is the way it is. And it just turns out the explanation doesn't explain what needs to be explained. Okay. But now we get to a harder case. The harder case is the intellectualist, or the modern-day cognitivist. I'm going to give two different kinds of intellectualists also. The intellectualist is harder for at least two reasons. One is he's often hard to identify in the text. It turns out that the intellectualist is usually a lot closer to Merleau-Ponty's position than the empiricist. And often it really looks like when Merleau-Ponty's describing the intellectualist account of a certain phenomenon, he's endorsing it. And it really looks like that's going on in the next paragraph, which is the paragraph that begins, there would seem, at least at first glance, to be a way of evading the question, namely, and so on. That's on 300 in my old version. Must be on 349 or something. That's where the account of the intellectualist starts. And about 2/3 of the way through the paragraph, you're thinking, boy, this sounds pretty good. And not only does it sound pretty good, it sounds like Merleau-Ponty thinks it's pretty good. Right? I mean, he really goes on for quite a while, speaking sort of in an apparently I mean, it looks like he's endorsing the view, but he's not actually endorsing the view. So how does the intellectualist account go? Well, the intellectualist, the good thing about the intellectualist is that he starts by making this distinction. The distinction between the size or shape or color that an object looks to be and the way that size looks in the current context. In order to make that distinction, it turns out, you have to admit, and the intellectualist does, and Merleau-Ponty thinks it's right to, you have to admit that the subject, in some sense or another, takes account of the contextual variation. So the subject, in some sense or another, when looking at the size of an object, takes into account the distance to it. Okay. Now, the famous kinds of contemporary cognitivist accounts, like accounts from a psychologist who used to be here at Berkeley named Irv Rock, are called in the literature taking into account accounts of perceptual constancy. So Irv Rock has an account, a taking into account of perceptual constancy, where he says, look, the important thing to notice about the experience of the size of an object is not that the experience of the size of the object correlates with the size of the retinal image projected from the object onto the retina. That's not true. We all know that's not true. But what is true, they notice, and it's true, and Merleau-Ponty mentions it too, is that there's a constant relation between the size of the image that's projected onto the retina and the distance to the object. So that as I get closer, the image gets larger, and as I get further away, the image gets smaller. But the ratio between the distance to the object and the size of the image is constant. Right? So in sort of mathematical terms, there's a linear correlation between the distance to the object and the size of the image. Okay, so that's a true fact. That's a true fact about our experience. And what you might think, then, is that that means that the subject, in some sense, takes into account the distance to the object in having the experience of the size of the object. It's true about color constancy also, there's a sort of constant correlation between the light that's projected onto the retina and the surrounding lighting context. It's true about shape constancy. There's a constant correlation between, and so on. Okay, so you have, but size is the easiest one. There's this constant correlation. So you have a mathematical account of how it is, apparently, how it is that we have this phenomenon of size constancy. So Merleau-Ponty's describing this in the beginning of this third paragraph. He says, there would seem, at least at first glance, to be a way of evading the question, namely by conceding that it's in fact never the case that size and shape are perceived as attributes of a single object, and that they're simply names for the relations between the parts of the phenomenal field. In this case, the constancy of the real size or shape which is maintained through the varying perspectives is merely the constancy in the relations between the phenomenon and the conditions accompanying its presentation. So the conditions accompanying its presentation, in the case of size constancy, just distance. Right? And there's a constant relation, there's a constant ratio between the distance to the object and the size of the image that it projects. This is a well-known mathematical fact. Psychophysicists know all about this. So you might think that's what's going on. You might think that what it is to have an experience of the size of an object as constant throughout variations in the distance to it is for me constantly to be taking into account how far away I am and somehow using that to give me the experience of the size of the object. Now there's two different things you might think are going on here. One is one that Merleau-Ponty doesn't talk about, but it really is the sort of the most prominent contemporary kind of account. You might think that what's going on is that it's not me as the perceiving subject that's taking into account the distance, but it's somehow my brain. It's a subconscious, it's a subpersonal thing, right? And nowadays in psychology, you have lots of mathematical psychologists and mathematical neuroscience, computational neuroscientists who are busy trying to give accounts of the functions, the mathematical functions that the brain has to be calculating or computing in order to give rise to these experiences. And here's one easy mathematical function, just a ratio between distance and image size. Okay. So if that's right, I suppose it is true that the brain has, in some sense or another, a representation of the distance to an object, or it may, and a representation of the size of the image that's projected from the object onto the retina, and it could just do a sort of long division, right? And you get a constant, since you get a constant ratio, it says, aha, 6 feet, that's how big you should experience it to be, right? No matter how far away you are. Okay, I'm now 7 feet away from it, and it still looks to be 6 feet because the image is projected, and so on, right? might be a good account of what's going on in the brain. Maybe. But it's not a good account of what's going on experientially. It's not a good account of the phenomenology of size constancy. And I think I'd like to suggest that insofar as it's not a good account of the phenomenology of size constancy, it's probably not a very great place to look for an account of what's going on in the brain either, though there's a contingent relation between those, and it might turn out that this kind of computational account really is what's going on in the brain. But by the way, there's all sorts of ways, psychologists claim, that we might get to have a subpersonal representation of the distance to an object. There's binocular disparity, the fact that my eyes, since they're not in the same place, have to come to focus on an object, and it's a different thing to focus on an object that's farther away. My eyes will be closer to parallel than it is to focus on an object that's close up. And since there's a correlation between how much crossed my eyes are and how far away the object is that they're focusing on, that might be a clue about for my brain about what the distance to the object is, and then I can just get that number, say 13 feet, and plug it into the computer in there, and then I've got the size of the retinal image, and I can just do the division. So the psychologists have got a kind of an account here. But what doesn't seem to be right is that that's a very good characterization of the way in which I experience the distance to an object. What doesn't seem to be right is that that's a very good characterization of the way in which I experience the distance to the object, or even, for that matter, the way in which I experience the size of the object. Ask yourself this question. When I look at an object, and I'm looking at its size, do I experience its size as a determinate value? Is it true that in my average everyday experience, that door looks to be 7.5 feet tall? Is that the way I experience size? Is it? Or if not, I mean, if it's not, what else can you say about the way I experience the size of something?
You probably best said to experience size and how the object affords itself to you.
Tell me more. What do you mean by that?
You know, if that door looks like a door that I could walk through, I would think that it's at least above, 6.5 feet tall, and based upon my experiences of how I walk through doors and how much space is above my head, that it would afford itself as that. But if there was a small door in a playhouse or something, it just, I wouldn't know what size it was per se. It was 4 inches tall by 2 inches, but I would know that I couldn't walk through it.
Yeah, okay. So that might be right. Maybe we experience sizes in terms of the activities that they afford, right? And big, an object that's of a certain size that's graspable might afford a certain kind of grip. An object of a certain size that's walk-throughable might afford a certain kind of walking through, and so on, or walking through with a certain posture, or so maybe. Okay, but I think that's a good suggestion. That's a possibility, and there may be other ways. But whatever's true, it seems like it's a very different thing to have an experience of the size of an object when you're trying to judge its determinate value, trying to judge its size, than it is when you have an experience of the size of an object in our normal everyday circumstances. So Christopher Peacock, who's a philosopher of mind and does philosophy of perception, who's an analytic philosopher, has a kind of intuition about this. He doesn't have Merleau-Ponty's account at all, but there's something interesting about him. He writes at one point in a paper, he says, look, there are some people who are very, very good at seeing things to be a certain size. He says real estate agents, they walk into the living room and they say, 14 by 17. Yeah. But he says, unless you're really used to doing that, I mean, you can develop the skill of seeing things to be a determinate size. But unless you've developed that skill, that's really not the way we experience the sizes of things. So far, let's leave it as a negative claim. It's really not the way in which we experience the sizes of things or the distance to things. But in order for this intellectualist account to work, well, you've got to have determinate values that you can plug into your function, right? I mean, if the brain's really computing this function, you've got to have some determinate values, 7.5 feet by 13 feet, right? In order to plug them into the, or so many centimeters on the retinal image. You've got to have determinate numbers to plug into the function. And what Merleau-Ponty says is that's what the intellectualists are missing. Even if it's true that the intellectualist makes the distinction between the size that the object looks to be and the way that that size looks, it's not true that they've missed some other phenomenon. They've missed some other aspect of the phenomenology, because they say that the thing looks to be a determinate value, a determinate height, and that's true because both the image that it projects on the retina is experienced as a determinate value, and the distance to it is experienced as a determinate value. And this determinate value is the ratio between them, image, the distance. Okay. Now, I've sort of conceded that maybe, as a function of the way the brain works, that's okay, maybe. But I've sort of suggested that as a function of the way the experience is, that's not right. Now let's go into that a bit. I said I was going to give two different kinds of intellectualist accounts. The first is the modern-day cognitivist unconscious processing account that I just talked about, due to Rock and so on. But there's another kind of account that you might give that would really attribute to the subject determinate experiences of the size of the image and determinate experiences of the distance to the object. An account like this, and you find them out there, an account like this would have to say that, in order to make this distinction, would have to say that when I see the size of the door, I experience both the size that it looks to be, and I experience the apparent size, the way that size looks in the current context. I experience something like the image that it projects onto my retina. I experience something like that. I think that it's hard to imagine that I experience both of those, and also I'd have to experience the distance to the object. I think it's hard to imagine that I could experience both the size the object looks to be and the apparent size, the retinal image, the sort of sense datum, simultaneously. It seems to me very difficult to imagine that we can experience both of those simultaneously. Now, some people are good at experiencing the apparent size, the image. What kind of person is good at that? What do you have to do to be good at that? Painters are really good at that, right? And what does the painter do? The painter sort of squints and says, if I were going to paint an image of that, next to that, I'd make something about this tall, and then the garbage can would be this tall, right? And the painter sort of squints, and Merleau-Ponty, I'm terrible at finding these passages, but Merleau-Ponty talks about the painter squinting, here we go, on my 307. Let's see, near the footnote, the long footnote that begins, indeed it has been shown, Gelb and Goldstein.
That should be 357.
Okay, the paragraph begins, in gaslight, a blue paper looks blue. So about three sentences down, he says, the painter achieves the same result without a screen, never mind what he's talking about, and manages to see colors as they are, or sizes or shapes, and so on, manages to see colors as they are determined by the quantity and quality of reflected light, provided that he isolates them from their surrounding by half closing his eyes, for example. Right? And that's a natural thing for you to do if you need to focus on the apparent property or the image. You half squint your eyes. But the intellectualist who's going to give an account of the experience of the constant size of an object by saying that first I see the size of the image and then take account of the distance to it, and thereby come to have an experience of the size. The intellectualist who says something like that is going to have to be committed to the idea that when I'm experiencing this thing to be a certain size, I'm also experiencing the apparent size, the image. And it seems to me that although you can switch back and forth between these, it's difficult to imagine having both of those experiences simultaneously. Okay, so now what Merleau-Ponty wants to emphasize is that the intellectualist has made an advance, but has still missed a certain important part of the phenomenology. So the advance that the intellectualist has made is that he's accepted that there is this distinction in the phenomenology between the size or the color or the shape that an object looks to be and the way that size or color or shape looks in the current context. But what he's missed is he's made the experience of these two things into an experience of a determinate value, a determinate size or a determinate shape or a determinate color. So Merleau-Ponty thinks that really what you need is an important kind of indeterminacy. Right? It's a script. That's an important kind of indeterminacy in the experience. And he thinks that any good account of the phenomenology is going to have an essential place for the indeterminacy that's a part of the experience of the constant size or shape or color of an object. So he says, now I want to go to 301.
350.
Okay, 350. So paragraph that begins, thus we place ourselves directly within the object.
It turns 351.
Okay. So this is the critique of the intellectualist or the cognitivist view. He says, if we give this kind of intellectualist account that says the experience of the constant size of an object is something we get from having the constant ratio between the image and the distance to it, then we place ourselves directly within the object and we overlook the psychologist's problems, that's to say the empiricist psychologist's problems. We overlook them because the empiricist psychologist, remember, didn't make this distinction at all, and the intellectualist can. But have we really left them behind? When it says that the true size or shape are no more than the constant law according to which the appearance, the image, the distance, and the orientation for shape constancy vary, it's assumed that they can be treated as variables or measurable sizes, and therefore that they're determinate, that we experience the distance to the thing the way the real estate agent does. When what we're concerned with is precisely how they come to be so, how we come to have experiences as of determinate quantity. Merleau-Ponty's idea is that in normal everyday life, we don't have that kind of experience. We have indeterminate experiences. This is sort of a placeholder still. We don't know exactly what it means. We have indeterminate experiences. And the question is how we could ever come to have experiences of determinate qualities. Kant is right in saying that perception is by its nature polarized towards the object. Kant is right, in other words, in rejecting the kind of Russellian view that says what we first see are the qualities, colors and shapes. And only later do we see them, or even in Russell's view, come to believe that they are qualities of an object. Merleau-Ponty thinks, and Kant thinks also, and this is what Kant got right, that our experiences are directed towards objects in the first place. And it's only in virtue of the fact that we already experience the object that we come to see its shape and its color and its size. Notice the way he described the phenomenon of perceptual constancy in the opening sentences. He said in the second sentence, a thing has in the first place its size and its shape. You don't believe that if you're a Russellian kind of empiricist. In fact, the Russellian kind of empiricist thinks that there's a basic problem. Contemporary psychologists think there's a problem like this too. Namely, the problem is all we can ever see, of course, they say, is the colors and the shapes and maybe the sizes of things. All we can ever see are colors and shapes and sizes. And the question is how we bundle them together into an experience of a single unified object. Right? What we first see are colors and shapes and sizes, and we got to somehow stitch them together. Hume had this problem. Russell has this problem. They identified objects as bundles of properties that aren't already tied together in some more basic fashion. And contemporary neuroscientists have this problem. They call this the glue problem, or the binding problem. How do these properties get bound together into an experience of a single unified object? And Merleau-Ponty says that's not right. And he says it's not right for the same, and he thinks Kant got it too. It's not right because it's not true that what we experience in the first place are isolated properties, not already tied together with one another. What we experience in the first place is an object, and we see it as having its properties. That's the way, so right from the second sentence, right in the way he's describing the problem of perceptual constancy, he's already rejecting a whole range of potential empiricist solutions to it. And he says Kant got that right. Kant's right in saying that perception is, by its nature, polarized towards the object. But what's incomprehensible in his account is appearance as appearance. I never know what that means, so I probably shouldn't have read that sentence. Let's just stop there. What's wrong about his account, he thinks, is that although Kant thinks we, and the intellectualist thinks, we experience the object, well, we experience it by having determinate experiences of the contextual features and of the appearance. So Merleau-Ponty says, we really need something else. We need an essential kind of indeterminacy in the phenomenology. There's an important sense in which the way we experience the distance to an object is not as a determinate value, not the way the real estate agent experiences it. Now, does anyone have any sense of what the tools are in Merleau-Ponty's toolkit to describe this kind of indeterminacy? There's another. Let's see. I guess it's in this chapter already. Towards the beginning of this chapter, Merleau-Ponty has a characterization of what it is to experience the distance to something as indeterminate. Anyone think of a passage where he's talking about that? Where he's talking about sort of an experience of the distance to something. It's not an experience of it as 17 feet. Think about it for a little bit. There's a place where he talks about seeing a painting in an art gallery. Have you guys talked about that? Maybe you've talked about that before. Okay. Well, this is the chapter where it comes up. Maybe you've seen it before, but this is the chapter where it comes up. In my book, it's on 302.
352.
252 or 1. 352.
Okay.
52 south.
Okay. So I'm going to start a little above the important part. I'm going to start in the sentence that says, for science and objective thought, an apparently small object. So this is now, in my version, on 302, about 10 lines down.
351 at the bottom.
Okay. I'm just going to read this passage, and then I'll say something about it. For science and objective thought, so for science and objective thought, that's to say thought that thinks that the only kinds of values, the only sort of kinds of experiences we can have are experiences as of determinate things. An apparently small object seen 100 yards away is indistinguishable from the same object seen 10 yards away at a greater angle. And the object is nothing but the constant product of the distance multiplied by the apparent size. That's the view that we just looked at. That's the intellectualist view. So the intellectualist view says there's no difference for science and objective thought with respect to size, between an apparently small object presented 100 yards away and the same object seen 10 yards away at a greater angle. But for me, the perceiver, there is a difference. And here's the difference. The object 100 yards away is not as real and present in the sense in which it is at 10 yards. And I identify the object in all its positions, at all distances, in all appearances, insofar as all the perspectives converge toward the perception which I obtain at a certain distance and with a certain typical orientation. So the idea is this. When the object is 100 yards away, if it's not a particularly big one, I experience it to be the same size. But there's a sense in which I don't experience that size to be as real and present as I do when it's 10 yards away. And the realness and the presence of the thing is going to be developed into what he's going to go on to say is that I can't get a good perceptual grip on the size of the thing. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I can't get a good perceptual grip. I can't see its size very well when it's 100 yards away. I haven't got a good grip on it. And he goes on to say that. This crucial perception, it's crucial because it tells you this essential fact about the phenomenology of the experience and size of object. This crucial perception ensures the unity of the perceptual process and draws it into it all other appearances. For each object, and this is the passage that maybe you've read before, for each object, as for each picture in an art gallery, there's an optimum distance from which it requires to be seen, a direction viewed from which it vouchsafes most of itself. At a shorter or greater distance, we have merely a perception blurred through excess or deficiency. We therefore tend towards the maximum of visibility and seek a better focus as with a microscope. So what's crucial about the indeterminacy of my experience of the distance to an object is that I don't experience it as a determinate value. I don't experience it as 17 feet away. I experience it as, well, too far away to see the thing well, to see the size of the thing well. At 100 yards, it looks like the object is not as real and present. He said, I feel immediately like I need to get closer to it in order to focus on its size. Right? And that essential indeterminacy is the crucial thing that the intellectualist account lacks, despite the fact that the intellectualist account does something good, which is to make the distinction between the size the object looks to be and the way that size looks in the current context. So the indeterminacy that's essential to the phenomenology of size constancy is that the way I take into account the distance to the object is by experiencing it not as some determinate value, but in terms of how well it allows me to see the thing. And it's going to, yeah, go ahead. Your question? Yeah.
Could you clarify what is the difference between the proper image of the object by the psychologist view to the optimal grade?
Good, yeah. I can. I think Merleau Ponty says something that's sort of related to that. Well, he doesn't say it as well as he needs to say. So I'll say. The psychologist recognizes that some distances are better distances than others from which to view the thing. Already Haring understood that. Haring said there's an appropriate distance from which to view the size of the object, and that's its true size. His mistake was to say that that's the way I experience its size no matter what distance I am from it, by replacing my experience of it now with the memory that I had of it when I saw it at that distance. But he recognizes that there is an appropriate distance. And Merleau-Ponty depends on the idea that I experience some distance to be appropriate. But the difference is that the appropriate distance for Merleau-Ponty has an essential kind of normativity built into it, an experienced kind of normativity. It's not just that it is the distance at which I see the size best. You could determine that by doing experiments. You could just see from which distance the subject is best at judging the size of an object. Right? You could ask them, well, what's the size here? And they could say 7'6". And you could ask them here, and you could ask them, at various distances what the size of an object is. And there will be some distance from which they are the best at judging that size. And that's all the psychologist needs. That's all the psychologist needs to say that there's an optimum distance from which to view the thing. That's the distance from which the subject makes the best judgments about what the size of the thing is, or makes the best judgments about what the shape of the object is, or makes the best judgments about what the color of the object is. But that's not the sense in which Merleau-Ponty understands the appropriate distance from which to experience the size of an object. For Merleau-Ponty, it's essentially a phenomenological fact. It's something that I experience in experiencing the size of an object, that I'm now too close to see it well and need to move back. I'm now too far away to see it well and need to move forward. It's not a statistical fact about me that I make the best judgments when I'm at this distance. It's a felt phenomenological fact that I need to get closer in order to pay attention to it. And I think that's why the picture in the art gallery is a good example. The idea of the picture in the art gallery, as I read it, is, if you've been to art galleries, you know this. You just find yourself coordinating your activity with respect to the painting when you're paying attention to it. You don't think about it. You don't make judgments about the distance to the object. You just immediately find yourself coordinating yourself with respect to the object when you're trying to pay attention to it. So if, for instance, I want to pay attention to the overall composition of the painting, I find myself backing up. I don't think beforehand that I want to back up. It's not because I've made some judgment about the distance to the object. I'm just immediately solicited to act that way in that context. And that's the sense in which I feel a kind of normative tug to put myself in the appropriate relation to the object. So the way I understand it, the psychologist could take the appropriate relation to the object just to be the statistical norm. Whereas for Merleau-Ponty, the appropriate relation to the object is really felt. It's really a part of the phenomenology. And in fact, that's the way in which I experience the distance to it, is in terms of whether that's a distance that requires me to move back or that requires me to move forward, requires me to increase it or requires me to decrease it. So I think that's the difference. One is a felt phenomenological norm, even if it's not noticed. It's just the kind of thing you automatically find yourself doing. And the other is at least potentially a statistical norm. Yeah?
So is this felt normativity task-related in the sense that it depends on what you pay attention to, the composition or the size of the painting, perhaps?
Yeah, it certainly is task-relative in one sense. It's certainly, I know this is a sort of background theme of the course, it certainly is task-relative in one sense. If I need to pay attention to the texture of the paint strokes, then an appropriate distance will be much closer, and it'll be felt to be much closer than if I need to pay attention to the overall composition of the painting. But it may be true that in another sense, this gets complicated, but it may be true that in another sense, even when I'm paying attention to the texture of the paint strokes, and so I'm very close up, I experience myself to be paying attention to the texture of the paint strokes of that painting. That's to say, a painting which, qua painting, requires to be seen far back. So there, I think there's a sense, and I think this goes along very well with that second sentence of the chapter that says a thing has its characteristics, its size and its shape. The idea is that I experience first the object, and only afterwards the various qualities of the object. Now, if I want to pay attention to some subset of the qualities, I may have to reorient myself, and there will be different norms. But insofar as I experience them to be qualities of that object, I already experience myself to be, say, too close to see the object, though quite in the right position to see its, this facet of it. Yeah. Yes, Olivier.
Your perceptual behavior is oriented by the fact that you want to see closely the brushworks and the details.
Yeah.
So what you're doing, it's not going against you, it's just to be clear about it.
Yeah.
And so what you're doing is task related.
What you're doing is task related. The question is whether in doing that you also experience yourself to have a relation to the object.
You do, because otherwise you couldn't even say you're experiencing the parts of the object.
Well, that's right. I think that's right. It all depends on whether what you think you experience first are parts or objects. And Merleau, Ponty, and Kant are both very clear, though for different reasons, that what you experience first are objects. And even if you're paying attention to some part of it, you experience it as a part of that object.
Of course, that's
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Intentional parts.
Yeah, intentional parts. That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. Yeah, Rick?
So, it seems like you have property constancies on the one hand and then this object constancy on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear how when the object is the focus of our attention, whether it's a painting or a property of a specific object, that I do experience this tension. But then there's also the problem of the background constancies of everything else. I'm looking at you and listening to what you're saying and noting your nodding gestures and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's all this stuff happening around the noises and the light and the colors.
Yeah.
And so it also seems like you want an account for the constancies of those things. And it seems, I wonder what that story would be and if it would be the same story.
I'm not sure I understood. I mean, I can say this much. I'm not sure if this is the distinction you're making. It is true that there's a difference between the phenomenon of color constancy, say, that I experience an object to have a constant color throughout variations in lighting constancy, and object constancy, say, that I experience an object to remain the same object throughout variations of presentation. And there are weird ways in which this can go awry. There are sort of strange neuropsychological cases where people can, where people come in and claim that, my wife was replaced by an alien. Because, and I can tell you, Doc, she was replaced by an alien. She looks exactly the same, but she's a different person. She looks, every visual property of her is the same, but she's not her anymore.
Does she still look kissable?
Well, that's not a visual property on this view, right? She looks the same color, the same shape, the same size, same haircut, same clothes, same skin texture, same, and so on. But she doesn't look kissable, and that may be related to why the person doesn't experience her as the same person anymore. So that wouldn't by itself be an explanation of it. I mean, it's equally possible that if she doesn't look kissable, it's because I've fallen out of love with her. Seems maybe more natural than that she was replaced by an alien. But anyhow, this is just to say there may be a phenomenon of object constancy where that's something that transcends even the phenomenon of the experience of an object as having constant properties. I can experience it to be constant or not, and this looks like and that may be a different issue. And when Merleau-Ponty says with Kant that it's objects that I'm directed towards, I think he does mean objects in the, to pervert a Straussian phrase, the weighty sense, right? I'm directed towards my wife, and now that she's been replaced by an alien, she's a different thing I'm directed. So that might be a different phenomenon that Merleau-Ponty sort of touches on, but doesn't characterize.
I guess what I was getting at was more, there almost seems to be like a chicken-egg problem in that you have the properties of an object on the one hand,
yeah.
and we say its properties.
Yeah.
And so it seems like Kant and Merleau-Ponty,
yeah.
on your reading, is going to place a priority on our sense of there being this one object there, and that is the object that has its blue. So you have
Yeah.
fully blue carpet
Yeah.
and these kinds of things. And so if there is this kind of priority on the object in that sense, I'm curious to know about stuff like the wall that's in the background. So I'm talking to you, but you know, like in your discussions about the color of the wall with Alva and others, and in contrast to Russell, then the wall's color becomes the focus of the conversation, and we start paying attention to the wall. But I'm curious about how we sustain the constancy of the wall while I'm just talking to you, and I don't even care about the color of the wall. And so I don't feel attention. I don't feel drawn to look at the wall when I'm talking to you. Yet I do experience the constancy.
Good. Well, I do have something long and complicated to say about this, and I will hope to try to say something about it Thursday. Roughly, the story is that the way in which you experience the wall when it's part of your visual field as the background to me, which is what you're focused on, is that you experience it as having a view on me. That you experience it as something that maintains me as a constant figure that has a backside, as Merleau says.
And that's how you explain that murky passage in
Yeah,
the
exactly. In the 68 or whatever in my version. Yeah, so that's the passage where Merleau says, I experience objects as seeing one another. I experience the chimney as having a view on the backside of the lamp.
Can I remind you that I suggested that you read Sean's paper, it's on the website, of Seeing Things in Merleau-Ponty, where he discusses this whole issue. And if you get time, and if you already read the Merleau-Ponty for Thursday, that's the thing to do, right?
Martin was saying it's hard to find on the website, is it?
But I was confusing exactly how the website is organized. It's on web, what do you mean by on the website?
On the website for the course,
There's a link.
There's a link to, what did I call it, a virtual reader or papers for the course, something like that. So you go to the you go to the department, you go to me, you go to my courses, you go to this course, and then you go to the...
Not this version, because I made a,
But you must have, how many have found the paper? It's not hard if you, if you're used to it. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, James.
I have trouble sometimes understanding the idea that there is one sort of optimal way of looking at an object. So suppose, just to simplify, that there's 4 properties of the object you're concerned with: its shape, its color, its size, and say its texture. I can just very well imagine that a variety of different perspectives on that same object will give me some ratio of balance between taking in those different properties, and there may be multiple different perspectives which grant me sort of an equal ratio.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily. I don't mean to say something determinate about that, but
No, I think it's an extreme oversimplification to suggest that there's one optimum position from which to stand to see the object best. I think in every real case it's false. It's false for a very simple reason. Once you've got 3-dimensional objects, right? I mean, in the case of color and lighting context, you can imagine that maybe in laboratory context the simplification actually works. So that there really is a best lighting context in which to view the color of this object today, given my mood and my visual acuity and so on. So maybe that's right. But once you get into real objects, it's sort of obviously false that there's a single optimal place to stand from which to see the object. And you don't even need to add other qualities. You can just make the object a full 3-dimensional object. And then, as Merleau says, the optimum view from which to see the object is the view from everywhere, not the Leibnizian view from nowhere. He rails against that. But the view from everywhere, because that's the view that presents equally all sides of the object. But of course, that's not a view that I can take, right? So every perspective that I take on the object is going to be a deviation in some way or another from that optimum. So the optimum doesn't have to be an optimum that I could take up, right? It doesn't have to be an optimum an optimum context that it's possible for me to be in order for me, nevertheless, to experience the current situation to be a deviation from it. And I think that's what will go on when you get these multiple qualities. I mean, the optimum will be this sort of crazy thing, and it's just sort of not possible to even to imagine maybe. But still, I could experience my current context, given my current needs and desires and so on, to be a deviation from it.
So when Merleau-Ponty says we have a tendency towards getting a maximum grip, do
Yeah.
you think it's that optimum, the unachievable one, that we're tending towards in some way?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of, say, the simple case of experiencing an object as a full three-dimensional object, to say that we're tending towards it is different than to say it's achievable or the kind of thing I could even imagine myself achieving. But it is to say that I can experience the current context as a deviation from it, in the sense that, well, here's a way to improve the current context. Get a little closer, or go around to the front of the object, and so on. Turn it right side up instead of upside down. Those kinds of norms will help me help to characterize the experience that I have of the context, even if there are deviations from an optimum that couldn't even in principle be achieved. That's what I think.
We've got to stop, but that's
Do we?
perfect for what we're going to do next.
Okay, so that'll set up. So yeah, that'll set up next time. Great.
Great job.